The spotlight was always on him. The man the world called the king of rock and roll. Elvis Presley stood on stage, hips shaking, voice soaring, and audiences screaming as if they were witnessing something divine. To millions, he wasn't just a singer. He was a force of nature, an icon who seemed immortal. But behind that legend stood someone history often treated as a footnote, a young girl who would sacrifice her innocence, her youth, and nearly her very self just to be with him. Her name was Priscilla Presley. Theirs wasn't just a love story. It was something far more complicated, something that blurred the line between romance and control. Picture this: Germany, 1959. Elvis, already a global superstar at the age of 24, meets Priscilla, a 14-year-old schoolgirl, a child by every definition, swept into a world of glamour and danger before she even understood what it meant to be a woman. The age gap was staggering, but the allure of the king's attention was irresistible, not only to Priscilla, but to her parents, who could hardly believe the most famous man in the world was inviting their daughter into his orbit. To the public, their relationship would one day look like a fairy tale, America's golden couple living behind the gates of Graceland. But ask yourself, was this really a love story, or was it something darker? Because behind the cameras, behind the polished interviews and the glitter of stardom, there were rules, restrictions, and sacrifices. Priscilla wasn't just Elvis's partner. She was being carefully shaped, molded, and controlled to fit into his world. And yet, the world adored the fantasy. Headlines screamed of glamour, of devotion, of perfection. But behind those gates at Graceland, secrets lived in silence. And once you hear them, you'll never look at the king or his queen the same way again. Because what began as the dream of a teenage girl would soon turn into a haunting tale of power, control, and survival. The real question isn't how Elvis lived. The real question is, what did it cost Priscilla Presley to stand beside him? Priscilla Presley was not born into fame. She was a military daughter, a child accustomed to discipline, structure, and the quiet rhythm of life on foreign bases. Her father was an Air Force officer, and her upbringing was marked by rules, respect, and distance from the world of celebrity. She was soft-spoken, obedient, and in many ways sheltered. But in 1959, when her family was stationed in West Germany, fate intervened, and her life would never again be her own. It was there, in Bad Nauheim, that she first met Elvis Presley. He was already the most famous young man on earth, drafted into military service but still larger than life. Women across the world sent letters, pictures, and desperate pleas for his attention. Yet here he was, standing before a shy 14-year-old girl. The first encounter was surreal. Priscilla, dressed like the child she was, bow in her hair, books in her arms, never imagined she'd capture his attention. But Elvis noticed. He leaned in, speaking gently, almost charmingly, as though he saw something no one else did. To a teenager, on the cusp of adulthood, it felt like magic. To her parents, it felt like danger. After all, he was 10 years older, an international star, a man whose life could never possibly align with a schoolgirl's. But Elvis was persuasive, respectful on the surface, and relentless underneath. Her parents resisted at first, but Elvis courted not just Priscilla, but her family. He assured them he would treat her with respect, that he understood she was young. And so, permission was given. Hesitant, nervous, but permission nonetheless. The world would never have known it then, but this was the first turning point in Priscilla's story. Because what looked like a fairy tale invitation was the beginning of a carefully crafted molding process. Elvis swept her into his world slowly, but with precision. He dictated the music she listened to, the way she dressed, even the friends she was allowed to keep. Priscilla's teenage years, those fleeting years of dances, first loves, and discovering identity, were sacrificed on the altar of Elvis's fame. She wasn't free to be a normal girl. She was being groomed to be Elvis's ideal woman. The cost: isolation. Her friends grew up without her. While they explored youth, she lived in waiting, caught between the innocence of girlhood and the demands of a man who was already a legend. Elvis gave her attention, yes. He gave her luxury, yes. But he also gave her rules. And for a girl desperate to belong in his world, saying no wasn't an option. To the outside world, it looked like destiny, a king and his chosen one. But inside Priscilla's heart, questions lingered. Was this truly love, or was she slowly being shaped into a life she didn't choose? The imbalance was clear. Elvis was the king, adored, unstoppable. Priscilla was the child, learning to play queen before she even understood what it meant to be herself. And behind every whispered secret, every stolen moment, a truth was building, one that would erupt behind the closed doors of Graceland. To the world, Elvis and Priscilla were a dream. The photographs told one story: the king of rock and roll and his beautiful young bride living in America's most famous mansion. Newspapers called it a fairy tale, fans saw it as destiny, and Hollywood painted it as romance. But what the flashbulbs never captured was what life inside Graceland truly meant for Priscilla Presley. At first glance, Graceland was paradise, a mansion with endless rooms, gleaming cars in the driveway, and parties filled with the biggest names in music and film. But the Golden Gates were also bars of a cage. Behind them, Priscilla wasn't free. She was a young woman under constant watch, constantly molded by Elvis's expectations. Elvis demanded control over nearly every detail of her appearance. The way she dressed, the colors she wore, even the way she styled her hair, none of it was left to chance. "You'd look better with darker hair," he once told her, and soon her natural softness gave way to the jet-black bouffant we all recognize. Her makeup wasn't hers either. It was his preference. She became less of herself and more of an image, a reflection of the woman Elvis wanted beside him. And while the world assumed she was living a life of glamour, Priscilla was often alone. Graceland was big, cavernous, and quiet when Elvis was away. Days blurred into nights as she sat in rooms too large, waiting for him to return. Loneliness became her silent companion, a constant reminder that she wasn't truly part of the glittering world outside, only a shadow of it. But perhaps the most painful truth lay in what she could not control. Elvis was unfaithful. The king surrounded himself with Hollywood starlets and beauty queens, women whose names filled magazines, women who visited sets and hotels, while Priscilla waited at home. Gossip columns hinted at it, insiders whispered about it, but Priscilla lived it. She knew, she saw, and yet she was expected to remain loyal, silent, devoted. Imagine the weight of that, to be married to the most desired man in the world, and yet to feel invisible. To the outside world, Priscilla was the lucky one, the chosen one. But behind closed doors, she was more like an accessory to Elvis's fame, a figure who had to sparkle when needed and vanish when not. Her life became a balancing act. Silence in the face of betrayal, obedience in the face of control, patience in the face of isolation. She was taught not to question, not to protest, not to disrupt the image. Elvis was the king, and kings were not to be challenged. But the truth is, silence builds pressure. Secrets behind those gates were mounting, and the tension in their marriage was no longer something that could be hidden. Because behind the glamour of Graceland was a truth darker than any tabloid dared to print, and soon the world would see the cracks begin to show. By the early 1970s, the dream was unraveling. Elvis Presley, the king adored by millions, was no longer the vibrant young man who had once commanded the world stage with fire and electricity. Fame had given him everything, but it had also taken its toll. And inside Graceland, Priscilla Presley was watching her husband spiral into a world she could no longer control. The Elvis the public saw still dazzled. He filled concert halls, he wore the rhinestone jumpsuits, he made women faint at the mere shake of his hand. But behind the curtain, reality was grim. His health was faltering, his moods unpredictable, his reliance on prescription drugs growing by the day. What began as a way to keep up with the demands of fame, pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to perform, became a dangerous cycle. Priscilla lived through the worst of it. She saw the erratic behavior, the bursts of anger, the paranoia that whispered through their marriage. Elvis, once tender and magnetic, could now be volatile, even frightening. There were nights when she didn't know which version of him would walk through the door, the loving husband, or the broken man trapped in his own fame. And all the while, the affairs continued. Hollywood gossip was no longer whispers, it was headlines. Women came and went, each one leaving another crack in Priscilla's trust. The world might have turned a blind eye, but Priscilla could not. "I felt like I was losing myself," she would later admit, and those words carried the weight of years lived in silence. The breaking point was not one single moment. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small betrayals. The loneliness, the humiliation, the emotional toll of loving a man who belonged more to the world than to her. Priscilla realized that if she stayed, she would be consumed by the shadow of his decline. And so, in 1972, she made the decision that shocked not only Elvis, but the world. She walked away. By 1973, the divorce was finalized. Yet even in that final moment, as cameras flashed outside the courthouse, Elvis and Priscilla held hands. To the world, it seemed like tenderness, like proof that the love was still there. But in truth, it was the last act of a couple hiding years of pain behind a single gesture. The public, however, wasn't kind. Priscilla was branded the woman who had abandoned the king. Fans couldn't understand why anyone would leave Elvis Presley, but those who judged never saw what she endured behind Graceland's doors. They didn't know the sleepless nights, the tears, the quiet suffering. Her marriage had been built on imbalance, and now it had collapsed under the weight of fame, betrayal, and addiction. For Elvis, the spiral would only deepen. For Priscilla, a new journey was beginning, one no longer in his shadow, but not without scars. Because if Graceland was a gilded cage, divorce was not freedom, it was survival. When Priscilla Presley walked out of Graceland for the last time as Elvis's wife, she wasn't stepping into freedom, she was stepping into the unknown. For years, her identity had been tethered to his. She had been Elvis's girl, Elvis's wife, the queen of Graceland. But who was Priscilla without the king? That question lingered in the air like smoke, and for the first time, she had to answer it for herself. Life after Elvis wasn't easy. She was a young mother raising their daughter, Lisa Marie, while navigating a world that still saw her only through the lens of Elvis's fame. But Priscilla was determined not to vanish into the shadow of his legacy. She began carving her own path, piece by piece, with a strength that surprised those who had underestimated her. She turned toward acting, something she had never been allowed to pursue during her marriage. Hollywood had always been Elvis's playground, but now it became hers. Roles in television and film gave her a new kind of spotlight, not as someone's wife, but as an actress in her own right. She wasn't chasing stardom, she was chasing independence, the right to stand on her own 2 feet. But it wasn't just Hollywood where she proved herself. Priscilla also became a shrewd businesswoman. After Elvis's tragic death in 1977, she made a decision that would change the course of his legacy forever. Graceland, once a private mansion of secrets, was transformed into a cultural landmark under her leadership. Many doubted her at first, but she proved them wrong. Graceland became one of the most visited private homes in America, securing Elvis's immortality while also cementing Priscilla's reputation as more than just his widow. And then came the revelations. In 1985, Priscilla released her memoir, Elvis and Me. For the first time, the world glimpsed the truth behind the fairy tale. She revealed the strict rules, the isolation, the affairs, the control. It was raw, painful, and shocking. But it was also liberating. By telling her story, Priscilla reclaimed her voice. She was no longer the silent girl molded to fit someone else's dream. She was a woman speaking her truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made others. Through it all, she remained fiercely protective of her daughter, and surprisingly, of Elvis himself. Despite the betrayals, despite the pain, she never tried to destroy his image. Instead, she guarded his legacy while finally building her own. It was a paradox only she could live with, preserving the king for the world, while freeing herself from the chains of his crown. The world began to see her differently. She was not just Elvis's wife. She was a survivor of the fame machine, a woman who endured the impossible and emerged stronger. Priscilla Presley became proof that even in the shadow of a legend, one could find the light of their own identity. But that light came at a cost, because loving a legend is never without scars. Priscilla Presley's story has often been told as a romance, wrapped in the glitter of Graceland and the magic of Elvis's music. But the truth is far heavier, far more human. It is the story of a young girl who gave up her childhood to stand beside a man the world worshipped. It is the story of sacrifice, of silence, of enduring love, and of survival. To love Elvis Presley was to live in a world where millions wanted a piece of him, where his flaws were magnified by fame, and where her own identity was often erased. For Priscilla, every day was a negotiation between devotion and self-preservation. The cost of being the king's wife was her own youth, her voice, her freedom. And yet, she did not let the story end in tragedy. Priscilla turned pain into power. She raised their daughter, built a career, and safeguarded Elvis's legacy so the world would never forget him. But she also made sure that her own name would not disappear into his shadow. Through her resilience, she became more than a footnote. She became a testament to survival. Her story forces us to ask a haunting question. Was she a victim of circumstance, or a woman who reclaimed her destiny? Perhaps she was both. What cannot be denied is this: while Elvis Presley will forever be remembered as the king, Priscilla Presley should be remembered as the woman who endured, who adapted, and who rose above the storm of fame. She remains the keeper of his memory, but her true legacy is resilience. And so, when we remember the king, we must also remember the price paid by the woman beside him. Because when love collides with fame, it's never the legend who pays the highest price, it's the one left standing in the silence afterward.